My name is Gaia Thorne. I'm 34 years old, and until recently, I believed I understood the architecture of my own life. On the surface, I'm the woman people describe as steady. I work as a policy analyst for a mid-sized environmental nonprofit in Seattle. I read contracts for a living. I notice details. I ask questions that other people forget to ask. But socially, I've often been perceived as gentle, accommodating, the kind of woman who smooths over awkwardness before it turns into conflict. People underestimate quiet women. They assume that if you don't interrupt, you don't notice. If you don't raise your voice, you don't have boundaries. If you smile when something feels off, you must not recognize it. 3 months after my wedding, I discovered our marriage certificate was never filed. That sentence still feels unreal when I say it out loud. There was no screaming argument, no dramatic revelation in the rain, just a simple request at the county records office, a formality, really, and a clerk who politely informed me that no legal record of my marriage existed. According to the state, I was not a wife. What follows is not a story about explosive betrayal. It's not about revenge or courtroom theatrics or a master plan executed overnight. It's about something quieter, slower, more unsettling. It's about realizing that the foundation beneath your feet was never poured. It's about understanding how easily we can accept small inconsistencies when love is involved. How we rationalize discomfort because confronting it feels larger than we are ready for. And how silence, the kind people mistake for weakness, can become something else entirely. I won't tell you this story to paint myself as a victim. I made choices. I overlooked things. I believed explanations that were convenient because they preserved the life I thought I had. But I will tell you the truth. I'll tell you about the tiny moments that didn't seem important at the time. The comments that slid past me. The paperwork that must have been handled. The way everyone, including me, assumed the ceremony was the same thing as legality. And I'll tell you what changed after I realized it wasn't. This isn't a story about destroying someone. It's about clarity. About reclaiming authorship over your own life when you discover it's been ghost-written. If you've ever had that quiet, private moment where reality shifted just slightly and you were the only one who felt it, then you might understand what came next. Have you ever discovered something small that quietly rewrote everything you thought was true? Before the paperwork, before the quiet unraveling, I was the dependable one. To my husband, Adrian, I was the steady hand. He liked saying that about me in front of friends, usually with a half smile that made it sound like a compliment. Gaia keeps me organized. Gaia thinks of everything. And I did. I handled the venue contracts for our wedding because you're better at reading the fine print. I kept track of RSVPs, dietary restrictions, and payment schedules. I triple-checked the florist's invoice when the totals didn't quite align. I drafted our honeymoon itinerary down to the minute, not because I'm rigid, but because I find comfort in knowing the edges of things. People mistake preparedness for anxiety. At work, my colleagues relied on me to spot the clause buried on page 37 that could derail a partnership. I was the one who quietly flagged inconsistencies before they became headlines. I didn't need credit. I needed things to be correct. In Adrian's circle, mostly entrepreneurs and creative freelancers, I was the grounded one. They teased me about spreadsheets and called me the adult in the room. It was affectionate, mostly, but there's something subtle about being cast as the responsible one. It comes with an invisible expectation. You will absorb the uncertainty so others don't have to. In our relationship, I handled the practicalities. He handled the big visions. At least, that's how it was framed. Adrian was charismatic, quick-witted, the kind of man who could turn a half-formed idea into an enthusiastic conversation. People leaned in when he spoke. I leaned back. I didn't mind that dynamic. I've never needed the spotlight. But I did assume that competence went both ways, that if I managed the details of our shared life, he managed his promises with equal seriousness. When we planned our wedding, there were small moments almost invisible where I stepped in because something hadn't been followed through. The officiant paperwork, the photographer's deposit, the timeline confirmation. Already handled, he would say lightly. Sometimes it had been. Sometimes it hadn't. I always notice, but love has a way of smoothing the edges of doubt. If I asked twice, I felt like I was policing. If I asked 3 times, I felt controlling. And I had spent most of my life trying not to be too much. That phrase followed me from childhood, a well-meaning mother who encouraged softness over assertiveness. Teachers who praised my composure but overlooked my leadership. I learned early that being agreeable made rooms more comfortable. So in our marriage, I became what everyone already believed I was: reliable, adaptable, unthreatening. At family gatherings, his mother would squeeze my hand and say, "You're exactly what Adrian needs." Not what I needed, what he needed. I didn't resent it. Not then. I interpreted it as validation. I thought being someone's stabilizer meant being cherished. But there's a difference between being valued and being convenient. 3 months after the wedding, when I walked into the county records office to request a certified copy of our marriage certificate purely for administrative reasons, something my employer required for benefits processing, I carried the same quiet confidence I always did. I assumed it would be routine. The clerk typed our names into her system. She frowned, not dramatically, just slightly, the way someone does when a search result loads slower than expected. "I'm not seeing a filing under that name," she said gently. "Are you sure it was submitted?" In that moment, I didn't panic. I didn't accuse us. I simply felt something small and cold settle into my chest. Because if there was one thing I'd always been known for to him, to others, even to myself, it was that I didn't miss details. And yet somehow, the most important document of my life might not exist. Looking back, I realized something unsettling. I had built my identity around being the one who ensured everything was handled. But what happens when the thing you assumed was handled wasn't? And more importantly, who was I to them? Really, if I never questioned the role they handed me, the first small cut didn't happen at the records office. It happened weeks before the wedding. At the time, I dismissed it as stress. Weddings are chaotic. Details blur. People forget things. I told myself that forgetting is human, and love means allowing room for humanity. We had just finished a tasting session with the caterer. I was glowing from relief because everything had gone smoothly. The menu was finalized, the timeline confirmed. I remember standing outside the venue with my leather planner tucked under my arm, feeling proud of how seamlessly it had come together. That's when I asked him, casually, "Did you drop off the signed marriage license application with the officiant as we discussed?" It wasn't accusatory. It was a routine check. He exhaled sharply, not angrily, but with irritation thinly disguised as humor. "Gaia, relax. I said I'd handle it." "I know," I replied. "I just wanted to confirm it was submitted." He laughed. But it wasn't a warm laugh. It was performative, loud enough for the valet attendant nearby to hear. "She triple checks everything," he said to no one in particular. "It's adorable." Adorable. The word landed oddly. Not cruel, not even overtly dismissive, but it reduced something competent into something cute, harmless, decorative. I felt heat rise to my face, and I smiled the way I always do when I'm unsure whether I'm overreacting. "I just want it done properly," I said softly. "It is," he replied, already glancing at his phone. "Trust me." Trust me. There it was. A simple request reframed as doubt. A logistical question turned into a commentary on my personality. Later that evening, I replayed the exchange in my mind. I tried to measure it objectively, the way I would analyze language in a contract. Was it disrespect, or was I being sensitive? He hadn't insulted me. He hadn't refused outright. He'd simply deflected, and everyone else around us that day had laughed along, charmed by his energy. No one noticed the way my question evaporated midair. No one registered that he hadn't actually answered it. I told myself it didn't matter. In relationships, you pick your battles. That's what people say. And this didn't feel like a battle worth choosing. It felt small. But small things have a way of embedding themselves. After that, I stopped asking twice. If he said something was handled, I let the conversation end there. Not because I was convinced, but because I didn't want to become the controlling fiancé who couldn't let go. I wanted to be easy to love, and so I adjusted, quietly. The officiant showed up on the wedding day. The ceremony was beautiful. The paperwork was signed after we said our vows. I remember holding the pen, watching him sign his name in looping strokes. Witnesses signed, smiles all around, champagne. In my mind, that was the end of it. Documents signed, process complete. But I never physically saw the envelope mailed. I never followed up. Not because I forgot, but because I remembered that word. Adorable. Somewhere inside me, A subtle calculation formed. It is safer to be agreeable than to be right. That was the first small cut. Not the missing filing, not the clerk's confusion, but the moment my diligence became something to tease instead of respect, I allowed it. When I look back now, I don't see malice in his face that day. I see impatience, ego, a need to feel unchallenged, and I see myself choosing harmony over clarity. Have you ever ignored a small discomfort because acknowledging it would change the dynamic entirely? The strange thing about subtle dismissal is that it doesn't arrive as a thunderclap. It arrives as a pattern. After that day outside the venue, I began noticing a rhythm to our conversations, particularly when the subject involved logistics, accountability, or anything that required follow-through. If I asked a clarifying question, he reframed it as a worry. If I asked for confirmation, he reframed it as doubt. If I requested documentation, he reframed it as distrust. Each time, the tone was light, playful, even. Gaia, you're auditing me again. You know not everything needs a spreadsheet. Babe, life isn't a compliance report. Delivered with a grin, often in front of other people. And because there was laughter attached, I began to question my interpretation. Humor is powerful camouflage. It makes it socially inconvenient to object. No one wants to be the woman who can't take a joke. So I started adjusting in small, almost imperceptible ways. When he told me he'd transferred money into our joint account for the honeymoon expenses, I didn't verify it immediately. I waited. When I eventually checked and saw it hadn't been done yet, I told myself he was busy. When he mentioned he'd handled updating his address with the bank, I nodded. Weeks later, when mail still arrived at his old apartment, I said nothing. I began managing the discrepancies, silently fixing what needed fixing without announcing it. That's the dangerous part about being competent. You can compensate for someone else's inconsistency so seamlessly that even they forget they were inconsistent. And I was very good at smoothing edges. But something inside me kept a quiet ledger. Not of offenses, not of revenge, just a reality. I noticed that when I missed a detail which was rare, it was gently highlighted. When he missed one, it was contextualized, explained, minimized. He's just more creative-minded. That's not his strength. You're better at that stuff anyway. Better at that stuff. The role assignment was becoming clearer. I was the infrastructure. He was the vision. And infrastructure doesn't get applause. It's expected. 3 months into our marriage, when my employer requested a certified copy of our marriage certificate for health insurance documentation, I felt a flicker of irritation that I hadn't already secured one. That was unlike me. I'll grab it this week, I told him one evening. Sure, he replied absently, scrolling through his phone. There was no hesitation in his voice, no curiosity, no concern. In hindsight, that absence is loud. On the drive to the county office, I remember feeling slightly embarrassed that I hadn't confirmed the filing myself sooner. It felt like an oversight on my part, a deviation from the meticulous woman everyone believed I was. When the clerk told me there was no record, I didn't immediately think of deception. I thought administrative delay, because that narrative preserved everything else. But as she double-checked the spelling, then the date, then searched for his name independently, and still found nothing, a different memory surfaced. Trust me, I had normalized the dynamic so thoroughly that even standing in that office, staring at a blank system entry where my marriage should have been, my first instinct was to rationalize. Maybe the officiant forgot. Maybe it was lost in transit. Maybe it was a clerical backlog. What I did not think was, why didn't he ensure it was filed? That question felt almost disloyal, which is when I realized something far more unsettling than missing paperwork. I had slowly trained myself to distrust my own need for verification. The normalization hadn't happened overnight. It happened in laughter, in teasing, in gentle redirection. Disrespect doesn't always shout. Sometimes it smiles. And I had been smiling back. Tell me when something repeats just often enough to feel familiar. How do you know when it has crossed the line? It took the absence of a legal document for me to finally see the script I had been following. Not just in our marriage, but in every room I had ever walked into. There is a specific kind of woman people feel safe assigning responsibility to. She is calm under pressure. She anticipates needs before they are voiced. She doesn't make scenes. She doesn't embarrass anyone. She fixes things quietly and moves on. I had become that woman so completely that no one questioned it, including me. In the weeks after the Clark's search returned, nothing. I didn't confront Adrian immediately. I told myself I needed facts first. That was my training, my instinct. So I requested the public filing logs for the week of our ceremony. I confirmed the officiant's credentials. I reviewed the procedural guidelines for submission timelines in Washington state. Everything was clear. The signed license must be returned by the officiant within 30 days to be legally recorded. Ours hadn't been. When I asked Adrian gently whether he had followed up with the officiant after the wedding, he looked surprised. Followed up for what? For the filing, I said carefully, to make sure it was submitted. He frowned, as if I had introduced unnecessary complexity into an otherwise simple life. That's their job, he said. Why would I micromanage that? Why would I micromanage that? There it was again. The subtle reframing, my diligence translated into excess. I just assumed you'd want to confirm, I replied. He shrugged. Gaia, you worry too much about paperwork. It was almost impressive how smoothly my question became a character flaw. But this time, something inside me didn't immediately bend. I began replaying the last year of our relationship through a different lens. When vendors hadn't been paid on time, and I stepped in, it became my responsibility. When shared expenses were miscalculated, and I adjusted them, it became my responsibility. When his freelance contracts lacked clarity, and I suggested revisions, it became my legal brain. But when it came to something foundational, something that required equal accountability, it was suddenly unnecessary to verify, because that wasn't his role, and I had never explicitly negotiated mine. Reliable, useful, invisible. That was the quiet assignment. At family dinners, I refilled glasses before anyone asked. I cleared plates while conversations continued without pause. His mother would smile approvingly. She keeps everything together. It sounded like admiration. But admiration can be another word for dependence when it only flows in one direction. The more I reflected, the more I realized something uncomfortable I had been chosen, in part, because I made things easier. Not challenged, not demanded, easier. And I had accepted that because it felt like love. The day I fully understood the role I was assigned wasn't dramatic. It was ordinary. Adrian had forgotten to cancel a subscription tied to his old apartment, one I had reminded him about twice before the move. When the charge appeared on our joint account, he glanced at it and said casually, "Can you just handle it? Just handle it." Not because I caused it, not because it was mine, but because that was the expectation now. In that moment, the pattern crystallized. I wasn't his partner in logistics. I was his safety net. And safety nets aren't consulted before someone jumps. They're simply assumed. I went to bed that night with a new awareness, not anger, not yet, but clarity. If the marriage certificate had never been filed, it wasn't an isolated oversight. It was consistent with the role I had been living in all along. The question wasn't whether a document was missing. The question was why I had accepted being the only one responsible for making things real. Have you ever realized that the role you're praised for is the very thing that keeps you unseen? The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen in the records office either. It happened on a Tuesday morning, in complete silence. Adrian had left early for a client meeting. I was alone at the kitchen table with my laptop open, the county's procedural guidelines still bookmarked. Outside, Seattle rain traced slow, deliberate lines down the window, the kind of steady rainfall that makes everything feel suspended. I had called the officiant the day before. He sounded embarrassed. "Oh my God," he said, voice tightening. "I assumed your husband mailed it." I handed him the envelope after the ceremony, stamped and addressed. I remember gripping my phone a little harder. "You handed it to him?" I asked. "Yes, I always do that if the couple prefers to mail it themselves." He said he'd take care of it. He said he'd take care of it. Not the officiant's oversight, not a bureaucratic delay, a choice. I thanked him politely and hung up. And there, in the quiet of my kitchen, I allowed the reality to settle without rushing to soften it. He hadn't forgotten to check. He had volunteered to handle it. And then he hadn't. 3 months, 90 days of introducing me as his wife, of filing joint taxes as married in conversation, of discussing future children and shared property, all while the one document that legally anchored those words sat somewhere or nowhere. I expected anger to surge. I expected tears. Instead, What came was stillness, a precise, almost clinical recalibration of understanding. Because this wasn't about the paper itself. It was about intention. When I asked him that evening carefully, neutrally, whether he remembered mailing the license, he paused just slightly before answering. Of course, he said. Why? The officiant mentioned he gave it to you. He blinked, a micro-expression, almost imperceptible. Right, he said slowly. I mailed it. Maybe it got lost. Maybe it got lost. The ease of that answer told me more than the words. There was no urgency in his voice, no instinct to call the county together, no immediate action plan, just a casual shrug. We can sort it out, he added. It's just paperwork. Just paperwork. That phrase again, minimizing the very thing that makes agreements binding. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted inside me. Not because I proved he was lying, I didn't have evidence of that yet, but because I realized he was comfortable with ambiguity in a space where I required certainty. Marriage, to me, was not symbolic, it was structural, and I had just learned that he was willing to let the structure remain optional. I didn't argue, I didn't accuse. I simply said, I'll contact the county again tomorrow. He nodded, already moving on to another topic. That was the second shift, the recognition that my concern was mine alone. That night, lying in bed beside him, I listened to his breathing steady into sleep. I studied the ceiling and let a new thought form one I had never allowed before. What if the missing filing wasn't a mistake? What if it were leverage? Not necessarily malicious leverage, but subconscious control. A way to retain flexibility, to keep one foot outside the door while performing commitment inside it. The thought didn't feel dramatic. It felt logical. And for the first time, I didn't rush to dismiss it. Instead, I reached for my planner the next morning and began documenting dates, conversations, exact wording. Not out of paranoia, out of alignment. Silence, I realized, could be more than accommodation. It could be an observation. And observation, when disciplined, becomes power. That Tuesday morning was the day something shifted. I stopped assuming we were operating from the same definition of permanence. And I started asking myself a different question. If the foundation was never poured, what would I choose to build next? After that Tuesday, I didn't confront him again about the certificate. Not because I was afraid, but because I was done asking questions that were treated like inconveniences. Silence, for most of my life, had been reflexive. A way to maintain peace, to avoid being labeled as difficult, to keep affection steady. Now it has become deliberate. There is a difference between silence that shrinks you and silence that gathers you. I began paying attention differently. When he mentioned a long-term investment idea, I asked neutral questions about timelines and documentation, not to challenge him, but to observe how he responded to specificity. When he spoke about our future house, I listened for language we will versus I might, commitment versus possibility. He didn't notice the shift in me. Why would he? From the outside, I was the same composed woman. I still cooked dinner. I still attended his networking events. I still smiled at the appropriate moments. But internally, I had stepped half a pace back. And that half step created perspective. I realized something subtle. Adrian thrived on admiration, not accountability. He loved being seen as decisive, capable, visionary. But when decisions required sustained follow-through, especially administrative or legal, his energy dissolved. Previously, I had bridged that gap automatically. Now, I let it exist. When he forgot to submit reimbursement paperwork for a shared expense, I didn't remind him. I waited. When a service provider emailed about an unsigned agreement, I forwarded it without commentary and let the silence sit. He began to feel small inconveniences that I had historically absorbed before they reached him. Nothing catastrophic, just friction. And I watched how he handled it. Sometimes he handled it quickly, almost defensively, as if aware of being observed. Other times, he delayed, then rationalized. Why does everything have to be so formal? He asked one evening when I requested written confirmation of a financial arrangement between us. It doesn't, I replied calmly. But clarity prevents confusion. He studied me for a moment, as though trying to recalibrate the version of me he thought he knew. The teasing diminished. The word adorable disappeared from his vocabulary. In its place was a faint uncertainty, not about our marriage, but about his ability to predict my reactions. I was no longer smoothing every ripple before it reached the surface, and that unsettled him. What fascinated me most was how quickly my restraint was interpreted as fragility. "You've been quiet lately," he said one night. "Is something wrong?" "No," I answered truthfully. "I'm thinking." That answer made him uncomfortable, because thinking implies evaluation, and evaluation introduces consequences. Meanwhile, I requested a formal status report from the county regarding the unfiled license. The response was clear. The original license was now void due to non-submission within the statutory period. To be legally married, we would need to reapply and hold a new ceremony or civil proceeding. I did not share that information immediately. Instead, I folded the letter neatly and placed it inside my planner. Silence had become a container holding facts until I understood what I wanted to do with them. He still introduced me as his wife at social gatherings. I allowed it, not because I agreed, but I was observing how easily words float when they are unanchored. He assumed my quiet meant forgiveness, or trust, or simple compliance. It didn't occur to him that quiet could be calculation. I wasn't plotting revenge. I wasn't planning exposure. I was recalibrating my position. If we were not legally married, then I was not bound in the ways I had believed. That realization didn't devastate me. It clarified me. For the first time since our wedding, I felt something unexpected. Not betrayal, freedom. Tell me when you stop reacting and start observing. What changes first, the other person or you? Preparation doesn't always look like movement. Sometimes it looks like routine. From the outside, my life remained unchanged. I still wore my wedding band. I still shared our apartment. I still attended dinners with his friends where they asked about married life and clinked glasses in celebration. But beneath that surface, I was recalculating quietly. The first thing I did was separate the information. Not money, not yet. Information. I gathered copies of every document that connected our names, the lease, the joint bank account agreement, shared subscriptions, and insurance forms. I read each one the way I would read a policy proposal at work, line by line, without emotion. Technically, we were cohabiting partners with shared assets, not spouses. That distinction mattered, because marriage carries legal implications that cohabitation does not division of property. Spousal rights, default inheritance structures. Without a filed certificate, those protections didn't exist. I didn't panic when I realized this. I felt focused. At work, I requested a private meeting with HR to clarify benefits eligibility. I didn't frame it as a crisis. I framed it as due diligence. The HR director explained that without a certificate, my spousal enrollment could not be processed. "Take your time," she said kindly. "Just let us know when you have the documentation." Take your time. The irony wasn't lost on me. At home, I opened a new individual savings account, something I had previously delayed because we were combining everything. I didn't hide it. I simply didn't announce it. When my next paycheck arrived, a percentage was redirected quietly. He didn't notice. Why would he? He had never tracked the inflow with the same scrutiny I did. I also scheduled a consultation with a family law attorney, framed neutrally as a request for clarification regarding unfiled marriage licenses. I wanted facts, not fear. The attorney confirmed what I already suspected legally. We were unmarried. If we chose to remarry, it would be a new legal act, not a correction of the old one. And if I choose not to, I asked, then you are free to separate without divorce proceedings, she said. Though property division may still require negotiation, free to separate. The word free settled differently now. None of this preparation felt dramatic, it felt administrative. Strategic silence is misunderstood because it lacks spectacle. Meanwhile, Adrian continued performing certainty. He talked about joint investments, about future renovations, about long-term plans that assumed permanence. I listened, and I noticed something else, something more subtle. He never once initiated refiling the paperwork. Not after I told him the county couldn't locate it. Not after I mentioned there might have been a submission error. He accepted the ambiguity, because ambiguity benefited him. Ambiguity meant flexibility. It meant no formal entanglement. It meant he could claim commitment socially while avoiding structural accountability. I began documenting conversations, dates, phrases, context, not to weaponize them, to understand patterns. The more I observed, the clearer the pattern became. He thrived in environments where expectations were implied, but not codified. And I had spent our relationship codifying things quietly behind him. What he never noticed was that I had stopped. I no longer correct minor oversights before they surface. I let small administrative inconveniences accumulate just enough for him to feel their weight. Not maliciously, accurately, and something fascinating happened. He became slightly more attentive, not fully accountable, but more cautious, as if sensing that the invisible safety net had shifted position. What he didn't know was that I wasn't tightening it, I was folding it. Preparation isn't loud. It doesn't require confrontation. It requires clarity. And clarity, once achieved, changes how you move through a room. I wasn't planning to destroy my marriage. I was preparing for the possibility that it had never legally existed. There's a difference. When you quietly gather facts, without announcing your doubts, you learn something powerful. People reveal themselves when they believe nothing is at stake. And he believed nothing was. Tell me, have you ever prepared for an outcome before anyone else realized one was possible? The clarity didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in a single, quiet sentence from the attorney, one that should have felt technical, but instead felt transformative. If he knowingly failed to file the license, she said, then legally speaking, there was never a marriage to begin with. Never a marriage. The words didn't sting. They echoed, because I had been slowly adjusting to that reality already emotionally, practically, psychologically. But hearing it articulated without sentiment stripped away the illusion entirely. There was no divorce to fear, no court battle looming, no legal unraveling required, just a decision. That was the private reveal. Not that he had failed to file the document, I already knew that. But that was the power dynamic I thought existed between us. Didn't. For 3 months, I had operated under the assumption that leaving would be complicated, that disentangling would require legal processes, public explanations, and financial risk. Instead, I learned that the structure I feared disrupting had never been secured. I walked out of that office into cool Seattle air feeling lighter, not because I was happy, but because I was informed. Information changes posture. When I got home that evening, Adrian was on the couch, laptop open, speaking animatedly about a potential partnership opportunity. They want a long-term commitment, he said. Something binding. Binding. I almost smiled at the word. And are you ready for that? I asked gently. Of course, he said without hesitation. When it's the right deal? When it's the right deal. That phrase lingered, because that's what our marriage had begun to feel like, a deal he hadn't fully signed. I went into the bedroom, removed my wedding ring, and placed it inside my planner. Not dramatically, not angrily, simply as an experiment. He didn't notice that night. He didn't notice the next day. On the 3rd day, he glanced at my hand. Where's your ring? He asked casually. I took it off, I said. It was catching on to things. He nodded, accepted it. No further questions. That told me everything. The private reveal wasn't explosive. It was cumulative. It was the realization that I had been more committed to the idea of permanence than he had ever demonstrated structurally. And now that I understood the legal reality, something inside me aligned. If there was no marriage in the eyes of the state, then what remained was a relationship built solely on intention. And intention, unlike paperwork, reveals itself through action. So I tested intention. I stopped using the word husband. I referred to him by name in conversations with close friends. I updated my emergency contact information at work to my sister instead of him. Small shifts. He noticed none of them. Or if he did, he chose not to ask. Which told me this wasn't oversight. It was a preference. Ambiguity worked for him, but clarity worked for me. And for the first time, I realized something profound. I was not trapped. I was not bound. I was not obligated to fix something he had chosen not to formalize. The leverage wasn't a legal action. It was knowledge. He believed I was still operating from the assumption of permanence. I was not. And when you see the board clearly, you stop playing defensively. The question was no longer whether he would correct the filing. The question was whether I wanted him to. Tell me if you discovered you weren't as bound as you thought. Would you rush to restore the bond or reconsider it entirely? The decision didn't come with a dramatic confrontation. It came with a spreadsheet. One Saturday morning, while Adrian slept in, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and divided a document into 2 columns. Option 1. Reapply for a marriage license, schedule a civil ceremony, file it myself, ensure legality, move forward. Option 2. Do nothing. Quietly disentangle finances. End the relationship without legal proceedings. Both options were possible. 3 months earlier, I would have chosen the first without hesitation. I would have framed it as a simple administrative correction, a clerical mishap, something to fix and forget. But now I asked a different question. If he had wanted to secure our marriage legally, would he have? Not eventually, not hypothetically. Already, the officiant had handed him the envelope, stamped, addressed, complete. All he had to do was drop it in a mailbox. He hadn't. That wasn't an accident of complexity. It was an omission of intention. And intention matters. I thought about what it would mean to reapply, to sit beside him at a county office, to sign another set of papers, to celebrate making it official months after believing it already was. Would that create security? Or would it teach him something else entirely, that I would repair structural gaps he left behind? I closed my eyes and imagined our future under both scenarios. In option 1, I saw myself continuing to double-check, to follow up, to ensure the dynamic would remain intact, only reinforced by my willingness to fix even this. In option 2, I saw uncertainty, discomfort, conversations I would rather avoid. But I also saw something else. Balance. Because for the first time, the decision wasn't about preserving an image. It wasn't about avoiding embarrassment or explaining anything to friends and family. It was about alignment. I asked myself a final, clarifying question. If he never brings up the missing filing again, what does that tell me? The answer was simple. He was comfortable without the structure, and I was not. That difference is not small. It is foundational. Later that evening, as we ate dinner, he casually mentioned a trip he wanted us to take in 6 months. We should book it soon, he said. Lock it in. Lock it in! I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized something had shifted beyond repair. He loved the language of commitment, but he avoided its mechanics. And I no longer wanted to be the mechanic of our permanence. I need to talk to you about something, I said calmly. He glanced up, mildly curious but unconcerned. About what? About the marriage license. He sighed softly, not dramatically, just enough to signal inconvenience. Gaia, we'll sort it out. I held his gaze. No, I said evenly. We won't. There was no anger in my voice, no accusation, just certainty. That night, after he went to bed, I opened my planner and wrote a single sentence across a blank page. I chose option 2. Not because I wanted to leave in fury, but because I refused to build permanence on hesitation. The irreversible choice wasn't ending the relationship immediately. It was decided not to formalize it. And once that decision settled inside me, everything else became implementation. Tell me when you realize someone avoided committing fully. Do you ask them to step forward, or do you step back? Once I chose option 2, everything became logistical. There is a strange calm that comes when a decision is made internally but not yet announced. The emotional turbulence dissipates. In its place is a sequence. Step 1, financial separation. I didn't drain accounts. I didn't hide money. I simply stopped contributing beyond my share of fixed expenses. I created a clean ledger of who paid what. Rent, utilities, groceries, transparent, factual, unemotional. I redirected my direct deposit fully into my individual account. He didn't notice immediately. Why would he? For months. I had managed the financial choreography so seamlessly that fluctuations felt invisible. Step 2, housing. Our lease was in both names, but renewal wasn't due for another 4 months. I began researching apartments quietly during lunch breaks. Nothing extravagant, just spaces that felt like mine, not ours. I toured one on a Wednesday afternoon. Small, sunlit, hardwood floors, no emotional symbolism, just practicality. I submitted an application that evening. Step 3, documentation. I requested written confirmation from the county that no marriage record existed. I printed it, filed it. I updated my beneficiary information on my retirement account. I removed his name from the emergency contact section on medical forms. None of this required confrontation. It required clarity. Meanwhile, Adrian continued life as usual. He spoke about joint plans with relaxed confidence. He mentioned a potential business expansion that would require us being flexible. I listened. And for the first time, I heard the asymmetry clearly. Flexibility from me, freedom for him. One evening, he asked casually, have you heard back from the county about the paperwork? Yes, I replied. And It was never filed. He nodded slowly, as if processing mild inconvenience. So we'll redo it, he said. No big deal. There it was again. No big deal. I held his gaze and said nothing. Silence is unsettling when someone expects reassurance. He shifted slightly in his chair. You don't want to? He asked, finally sensing friction. I don't think we should, I said evenly. The air changed. Not explosively, just perceptibly. Why, he asked. Because I don't want to formalize something that wasn't important enough to formalize the first time. No accusation, just a statement. He stared at me, trying to determine whether this was a negotiation or a declaration. It was a declaration. In the days that followed, I continued implementing without escalation. I informed the landlord that I would not be renewing the lease. I coordinated logistics for dividing shared furniture, itemized, fair, practical. He oscillated between confusion and mild irritation. You're overreacting, he said once. It was a mistake. Maybe, I replied, but it clarified something. He didn't ask what, because asking would require engaging with the possibility that this wasn't about paper, it was about intention. The apartment approval came through 2 weeks later. Move-in date, the first of the month. I scheduled movers. I didn't announce it dramatically. I placed the confirmation email in my planner and continued cooking dinner that night like everything was ordinary. Because in many ways, it was no shouting, no accusations, no humiliation, just action. The consequences hadn't begun yet, not fully, but they were in motion. And what he still didn't understand was this. By the time someone moves in silence, the decision has already been lived internally. Tell me, have you ever made a life-altering choice so quietly that the other person didn't realize it until the door was already half closed? The first consequence wasn't dramatic. It was logistical. When the movers arrived on a Saturday morning, punctual, efficient, neutral, Adrian stood in the hallway watching them wrap the dining chairs. You're really doing this, he said. Not angrily, not pleading, just surprised. Yes, I answered. He ran a hand through his hair. A gesture I had seen 100 times when a project didn't unfold the way he expected. I thought we were talking, he said. We did, I replied calmly. You said we'd redo the paperwork. I said I didn't want to. That's not the same as moving out. No, I agreed. It isn't. The difference between hearing and understanding is vast. For weeks, I had been implementing structural changes. He had noticed them in fragments, separate accounts, neutral language, the absence of my ring, but he had interpreted each one as temporary emotion. He had never recalculated the trajectory. Now, watching the bookshelf empty, he began to feel it. Consequences are rarely loud at first. They're spatial, a closet half vacant, a bathroom counter cleared of familiar objects, a silence at dinner where two voices used to overlap. He followed me into the kitchen as I sealed the final box. This is about a piece of paper, he asked, incredulous. No, I said gently. It's about the decision not to file it. He exhaled sharply. I told you it was a mistake. I know you said that. And you don't believe me? I paused. It's not about belief, I said. It's about alignment. That word unsettled him. Alignment suggests incompatibility without villainy. He preferred problems he could argue against, mistakes he could defend, accusations he could refute. Alignment is harder. It doesn't assign blame. It just observes a mismatch. You're blowing this out of proportion, he insisted. Am I asked quietly. He didn't answer, because somewhere he understood the truth beneath the surface. This wasn't a sudden explosion. It was the culmination of patterns he had dismissed. That evening, after the movers left and the apartment felt acoustically different, he sat across from me at the now partially empty table. So what are we? He asked. The question carried more weight than any of the previous ones. We're two people who had a ceremony, I said calmly, but we never built the structure behind it. That's unfair. Is it? His frustration sharpened, but he didn't raise his voice. Adrian was too image-conscious for that. I introduced you as my wife. He said, I meant it. I know, I replied, but meaning it and formalizing it are different. He leaned back, studying me as if searching for the version of Gaia who would smooth this over. She wasn't there. The consequences continued unfolding in small ways over the next few days. Friends texted, confused about my new address. His mother called, concerned, asking if we were going through a phase. He told them it was temporary, that I needed space. I didn't correct him. Not because I was avoiding the truth, but because clarity doesn't require public defense. The real consequence wasn't my absence. It was his realization that I was capable of leaving without spectacle, without begging, without bargaining, without rage, just certainty. And certainty removes negotiation leverage. For the first time, he was the one recalibrating. The safety net he had assumed would always hold was gone. Not cut violently, folded carefully. Tell me when someone begins to feel the weight of your absence. Do they mourn you or the convenience you provided? Panic doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like urgency disguised as logic. 2 weeks after I moved into my new apartment, Adrian showed up unannounced one evening. Not aggressively, just hurried, slightly breathless, as though time had suddenly become tangible. I made an appointment, he said before I even invited him inside. For what? The marriage license? We can go tomorrow. Reapply. Fix it. Fix it! He stood there like a man presenting a solution to a technical glitch. I stepped aside and let him enter. The apartment was still sparsely decorated, clean lines, neutral walls, boxes not fully unpacked. It felt intentional, unshared. He looked around, visibly absorbing the reality that this wasn't a temporary arrangement. I didn't think you were serious, he admitted. That's part of the problem, I replied. He winced slightly at that. I told you it was a mistake, he insisted again. I should have mailed it. I forgot. I was overwhelmed after the wedding. 3 months is a long time to forget, I said calmly. It didn't seem urgent. There it was. Not urgent. Legal recognition of our marriage had not registered as urgent. He sat down, elbows on his knees, leaning forward. I love you, he said. I chose you. Isn't that what matters? Love, choice, words that carry emotional gravity. But I had learned something important in the quiet weeks before leaving. Words are declarations. Actions are architecture. You chose me, I agreed, but you didn't secure us. He shook his head. That's semantics. No, I said gently. It's structure. He grew quieter, then not defensive, but unsettled. Why didn't you push harder? He asked after a moment. If it mattered that much, why didn't you make me file it? The question landed like a test. Because I wanted to see if you would, I answered. Silence stretched between us. He leaned back slowly, processing. For the first time, regret flickered across his face, not just about the paperwork, but about the pattern. I thought you trusted me, he said softly. I did, I replied, until I realized trust and verification aren't enemies. He looked down at his hands. I can fix it, he repeated, but this time the certainty was gone. And that's when I understood something crucial. The window for repair isn't about timing. It's about awareness. He wanted to fix it now because it cost him something, because I was no longer automatically absorbing the consequences. But repair motivated by loss feels different than commitment motivated by intention. I don't want to reapply, I said quietly. His head snapped up. Ever? I don't think so. The finality in my voice was not cruel. It was clear. He stood abruptly, pacing once across the small living room. So that's it, he asked. You're just done. I'm aligned, I corrected. He let out a hollow laugh, not mocking, but disbelieving. All over a technicality. No, I said over a decision. He stopped pacing, and I saw it then, the precise moment he understood that the dynamic had shifted beyond negotiation. He could no longer minimize this as an overreaction. Because I wasn't emotional, I was resolved. The panic came in subtle waves after that late-night texts asking if we could talk again, suggestions for counseling, promises of being more attentive. But the structural insight had already taken root inside me. He didn't forget to file the license because he didn't care about me. He forgot because permanence wasn't urgent to him. And permanence is not something I negotiate. By the time someone tries to fix what they once minimized, the lesson has already been learned. Tell me when someone finally understands the weight of what they dismissed. Is it growth, or simply fear of losing access? Our final conversation happened in daylight. No dramatic setting, no rain against the windows, just a quiet Sunday afternoon at a cafe we used to frequent, neutral territory, familiar but no longer intimate. He arrived early. I could tell by the way he was already seated, coffee untouched, posture rigid with anticipation. I sat across from him and folded my hands on the table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I've been thinking, he began carefully, about patterns, about what you said. I nodded, inviting him to continue. You always handled the details, he said. I assumed you would catch anything important. There it was. Assumption. And when you didn't push about the license, he added, I thought it wasn't that serious. I didn't push, I said calmly, because I didn't want to manage your commitment. He absorbed that quietly. The cafe noise hummed around us, cups clinking, low conversations, a barista calling out orders. Ordinary life continues without awareness of structural endings. I didn't realize you were testing me, he said after a while. I wasn't testing you, I corrected gently. I was observing you. There is a difference. Testing implies manipulation. Observation implies attention. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. So what would have happened if I'd mailed it? He asked. We'd be legally married, I replied, and I wouldn't have questioned alignment. He stared at the table. And now I've seen enough. The words weren't sharp. They were measured. He looked up at me, searching for anger, accusation, something he could push against. There was none. I loved you, he said. I know, I answered. And you don't anymore. I care about you, I said honestly, but I don't trust the structure. That seemed to confuse him. Love is emotional, I continued. Marriage is structural. I need both. He was quiet for a long time after that. I didn't think paperwork could mean so much, he admitted. It doesn't, I said. The decision behind it does. For the first time, there was no defensiveness in him, just recognition. I got comfortable, he said softly. You handled everything, I thought. That was our dynamic. It was, I agreed. And you're changing it. I already did. The confrontation wasn't explosive. There were no raised voices, no ultimatums, just clarity. We discussed logistics remaining shared items, final financial transfers, practicalities, as composed as two colleagues dissolving a partnership. When we stood to leave, he hesitated. So this is final? Yes. He nodded slowly. I didn't think you'd ever leave, he admitted. I know, I said. And that was the quiet truth beneath everything. He had mistaken my steadiness for permanence. He had assumed my reliability meant tolerance. He had believed my silence meant compliance. And I had allowed that belief until I understood that silence can also mean evaluation. We walked out separately. No dramatic goodbye. No lingering touch. Just two adults exiting a narrative that never fully solidified. The confrontation had no heat, because anger would have implied chaos. What I felt instead was resolution. Tell me when clarity replaces emotion. Does it feel colder or more honest? It has been a year since that conversation. When people ask about my short marriage, I correct them gently. It was a ceremony, I say, not a legal union. There's no bitterness in my voice when I explain it, just accuracy. Accuracy has become important to me. I still live in Seattle. I still work in policy. My days are still filled with documents, analysis, and long-term frameworks. But something fundamental in me has shifted, not my capacity for love, but my relationship to structure. I used to think being dependable meant absorbing uncertainty. Now I understand that being dependable also means depending on yourself. The first few months after moving out were quieter than I expected. Not lonely, just uncluttered. There's a difference. Without the background task of monitoring someone else's follow-through, my mental bandwidth expanded. I noticed how much subtle energy I had spent anticipating gaps. I stopped anticipating. I began expecting, not perfection, not constant reassurance, just congruence between words and actions. I wear my ring occasionally now, not the wedding band, but a thin gold band I bought for myself, not as a symbol of solitude, as a symbol of sovereignty. It reminds me that commitment is not about spectacle. It's about follow-through. Friends sometimes ask if I regret not giving him another chance. I consider the question carefully each time. Regret implies I acted impulsively. I didn't. I observed, I gathered facts, I evaluated alignment, and then I chose. That sequence matters. I don't see him as a villain. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't malicious. He simply valued flexibility more than formality. And I value structure more than ambiguity. Neither is inherently wrong, but they are incompatible in a marriage. The most surprising part of this journey wasn't discovering the unfiled certificate. It was discovering how easily I'd once minimized my own standards to maintain harmony. I had believed that being low maintenance made me lovable. Now I understand that clarity makes me respected. There's a different kind of peace in that. When I walk into a room now, professionally or personally, I don't shrink my questions. If something matters, I verify it. If something feels misaligned, I address it. Not aggressively, directly, The quiet dominance people sometimes comment on isn't new. It was always there. What's new is that I no longer use it to stabilize others at my own expense. I use it to stabilize myself. And perhaps the most important realization of all, the missing marriage certificate didn't invalidate my worth. It revealed my threshold. There's power in discovering what you will not negotiate. And once you know that, you move differently. Tell me when you look back at a version of yourself who tolerated more than you should have. Do you judge her or thank her for teaching you where your line truly is? 3 months after our wedding, I learned that our marriage certificate was never filed. A simple request at the records office revealed that our marriage legally didn't exist. At first, that felt like a technical failure, but it wasn't. It was a revelation of alignment. This story isn't about punishing someone for forgetting paperwork. It's about understanding what that omission represented. Commitment isn't proven in vows spoken publicly. It's proven in the unglamorous follow-through that no one applauds. Mailing an envelope, submitting a form, confirming permanence. Small acts, structural meaning. I didn't leave because I was angry. I left because I was clear. There is a quiet power in recognizing when someone values flexibility more than foundation, in understanding that love without structure may feel warm, but it does not hold weight. And perhaps the most important lesson I learned is this. Silence is not weakness. Silence can be observation. Observation becomes clarity. Clarity becomes choice. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to expose him publicly. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I only needed to decide what standard I was willing to live with. Some people will say I ended a relationship over a technicality. But structures are built on technicalities. A house without a foundation still looks complete until pressure arrives. So here's what I want to leave you with. If someone hesitates to formalize their commitment to you in whatever form that takes in your life, pay attention, not to their promises, to their actions. Because the permanence that must be requested is rarely permanence freely given. And walking away calmly is sometimes the most powerful declaration you can make. Now I want to ask you something. If you discovered that a commitment in your life was never truly secured, would you fight to formalize it? Or would you take that as the clarity you needed to step into something more aligned? I'm listening.